Andrew Burt is here this afternoon. We're delighted to have him. Andrew used to be a journalist here in D.C., where he worked as a political reporter for U.S. News and World Report, and then covered national security for a series of newsletters published by InsideDefense.com. But he's a very bright fellow and was admitted to Yale Law School. So he left journalism a few years ago to study law. And while at the law school, he got interested in the subject of political hysteria. He'll tell you a little bit in a moment about how that happened. And he was encouraged by some on the law school's faculty to spend time writing about that subject instead, as he puts it, quote, undertaking more traditional law school activities such as studying. Andrew did finish law school. He's now studying for the bar. And remarkably, he also finished this book. The book's entitled American Hysteria, The Untold Story of Mass Political Extremism in the United States. And in the book, Andrew argues that every few decades in the history of our country, a striking political phenomenon has emerged, one based on fear of a secret network infiltrating U.S. society and threatening destruction from the inside. This type of movement, Andrew says, doesn't dwell on the political fringes, but takes center stage, drawing large numbers of believers. To explain this phenomenon, Andrew's chosen to write about 5 examples, stretching from the Anti-Illuminati and Anti-Mason movements of the early decades of the Republic, through the Red Scare and McCarthyism of the 20th century, right up to the antisharia mania of today. These movements have involved blacklists and scapegoating, conspiracies and cover-ups, all following a general pattern related to people with power and social status feeling threatened and seeking to preserve their positions and prestige. In the final chapter of his book, Andrew offers some thoughts on how to confront political hysteria in the future. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Andrew Burt.
Why do we overreact to our fears? This is the main question underlying my book, where I explore where periods of extremism move from the fringes and dominate the mainstream. Think of McCarthyism, for example. We spent officially about 5 years in the early 1950s going after domestic communists without abandon. We actually fought the Soviet Union, a real existential threat to this country, for over 40 years afterwards. Why were we busy fighting communists at home when we had a real live enemy in the Soviet Union abroad? Or think of today, where a movement called the antisharia movement, which is premised on the demonization of Islam, the world's second largest religion. A movement that succeeded in banning Islamic law or Sharia from 1 in 5 states in the Union. Why are we fighting Islamic law at home when we have real-life violent Islamic extremists we're fighting overseas? So I start the book by describing how these movements work, why they arise, what they look like when they do, what characterizes them. And then explore 5 examples of each of these movements. The Anti-Illuminati movement of the 1790s, the anti-Masonic movement of the 1820s and 30s, the anti-communist Red Scares of the 20th century, each taking place after the major world wars, and then lastly, the anti-Sharia movement of today. And each of these movements is comprised of compelling characters and fun and fascinating stories. They're based around murder mysteries. One even took place around a murder mystery in upstate New York, gave rise to the first third party in American history. And I end the book by explaining what we can do when these movements arise, how we can help to lessen their sway. And so I'd like to start out by giving you a sense of what I'm here to do today, which is I'd like to tell you the story of how this book came to be, how I became fascinated in the stories that I explore. And then I'd like to tell you what I learned, my major takeaways from my over 3 years of studying these movements. And then I'll end by sharing with you one of my favorite moments that I came across while researching this book. But first, I'd like to start by thanking everyone who's here today. Writing a book is an extremely solitary endeavor, as is kind of going to law school, but I spent a lot of time in archival rooms reading very obscure texts, and I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be able to share my work and what I've written with everyone here today. And it makes it even better that it's at Politics and Prose, this vaunted institution about a mile from where I went to high school. So it really is amazing to be here today. I also have a few specific people to thank. First, to Politics and Prose, the staff, Davis, Candace, Mick, Brad, especially Abby Fenwald. All of you have been amazing. I'm really deeply grateful. And then most importantly, my amazing wife, who helped not only to structure and write the book, but helped me come up with the talk that I'm presenting today. So let me start with the story of how this book came to be. I graduated from college in 2008 and returned to D.C. to work covering domestic politics as a reporter for U.S. News and World Report. This was a time of deep and profound change. The recession was just taking place. The government was instituting the bailouts. We just elected the first African-American president in the history of the United States. And the Tea Party was just beginning to arise, and it was characterized by this deep sense of anger and frustration. And that sense of anger and frustration captivated a lot of people in the national media. And it was fascinating to me, but at the same time, something else caught my eye. It was related to the Tea Party movement, but it was wholly distinct from it. And this was the beginnings of the anti-sharia movement. And I remember watching in December of 2008 when a lawsuit was filed against the United States government for the bailout of AIG. Basically, the lawsuit said that the government had bailed out the insurance giant AIG, and the insurance giant AIG was providing financial products that were compliant with Islamic law or Sharia. And so the government was a partial owner of AIG. AIG was providing financial products that complied with Islamic law. Therefore, the argument was there'd been a violation of the separation between church and state. And the lawsuit was very quickly thrown out of court. But I noticed something very bizarre when watching people talk about the lawsuit and what it meant and what it stood for. So here, for example, is how one prominent backer of the suit described what was happening at the time. He said, "Make no mistake, there is an internal cultural jihad underway against our great nation. And I fear that many of our political leaders are unwittingly complicit in it." Again, he said there's an internal cultural jihad. So there wasn't just a violent jihad exemplified by the attacks of 9/11. There was some secret conspiracy, some secret ideological battle that this lawsuit was somehow engaging in. And this would be really the beginnings of an organized political crusade, one that would sweep across the country and one that wields deep and surprising power today. In May of 2010, for example, I watched as Tennessee became the first state to ban Sharia law from state courtrooms. 1 month later, Louisiana joined in. A few months after that, Oklahoma became the first state where over 70% of state voters on a ballot initiative voted to make Sharia illegal in state courtrooms. At the time, Oklahoma had a mere 15,000 Muslims in the state. The population was over 4 million. It was far from the front lines of the war on terror. And all of these laws were aimed at excluding Muslims from a fundamental arena of American society, from the legal sphere. And they basically banned things like Muslim marriage contracts, most of them done abroad, or arbitration agreements where two parties would agree to have any disputes settled with Islamic law, things that are, quite honestly, very marginal in the life of an average devout Muslim, but things that send a symbol. These laws are about sending a symbol that Muslims do not belong in American society. And so by the time I got to law school in 2011, I had a basic question in my mind, one that I had spent a lot of time thinking about, and that question was basically, what's going on here? What does this mean? A cultural jihad. How could something so outlandish to me, so outlandish, I suspect, to everyone here in this room, be so real to thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Americans across the country? And I had two fundamental intuitions in response to this question, both of which were borne out by the research I ended up conducting for the book. The first intuition was that what I was witnessing, the movement I was witnessing, wasn't actually about Islam. Islam here was simply a symbol for something much greater, a symbol for struggles and fears and anxieties that were much more profound. The second intuition I had was that we'd been here before, that similar movements had arisen in American history, and all I needed to do was, in essence, a history project stretching over 3 years, looking into these movements and trying to understand how they worked, when they arose, and what the leaders and the supporters of these movements said when they occurred. And what I found in all of this research was astounding. So let me tell you a little bit about what I learned. What I learned in researching this book is that the anti-Sharia movement is, in essence, almost a cookie-cutter version of a similar movement that's occurred throughout American history. Almost every few decades, movements like this occur, whether it's the Anti-Illuminati movement of the 1790s, the anti-Masonic movement, the 1820s and 30s, the Red Scares of the 20th century. They all boil down to the same thing. And that is, at essence, these are all movements that are arguments. And they're arguments about what it means to be an American, what it means to be us. And the way they make these arguments is they do it by exclusion. They isolate groups, Muslims, Masons, communists, you name it. And they say, we know who we are because we're not you. Because you, in so many words, do not belong here. And a crucial part of these movements is that they function by capitalizing upon a mixture of real and symbolic threats. And as an example, in McCarthyism, the real threat were actual Soviet agents who had been sent to the United States to infiltrate our society. It was a global superpower that was actually bent, that was actually it's one of its main purposes, its stated objectives, was to change our society. That was a very real threat. There's no denying that. And yet the symbolic threat for millions of Americans became the neighbor next door, became the school teacher down the street. As an example of just how profound that symbolic threat became during this period, over 13 million Americans took loyalty oaths during McCarthyism, as if they had to prove they were somehow not disloyal, as if they had to prove they were somehow American. I also learned how significant the stakes are when these movements arise. They arise and they're purported to be about minority groups, about groups that seem insignificant in the scheme of things. And yet, they arise and jeopardize our most fundamental values. They jeopardize our commitment to freedom, equality, our belief that there's strength and diversity, our belief that anyone can come to these shores to be who they are, regardless of their religion, their ethnicity, their background. They challenge the very values our country was founded on. But I also came across a forgotten moment in American history, one that I'd like to share with you today. It was defined by a forgotten character, and his name was Louis F. Post, and the moment occurred on May 7th of 1920. And he's in some sense a silent hero of this book, and for me. But before I can explain why, I need to give you a sense of some background of what was taking place. So this movement occurred against the backdrop of a widespread period of political hysteria in the aftermath of World War I. It was a time of deep turmoil. Labor strikes were sweeping the country. A bombing campaign perpetrated by radicals had been targeting the country's highest officials. Inflation was at 15%. 4 million veterans had returned home from the war. Prohibition was around the corner. Women were about to get the vote. Americans were really confronting deep changes at almost every level of their existence. And there had been a sweeping episode of political hysteria as a result. The Department of Justice, led by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, had begun sweeping up radicals, accused radicals, in what's now known as the Palmer Raids. In early January of 1920, federal agents in over 40 cities rounded up over 5,000 suspected immigrants, violating the rights of untold people in the process. In one example in Detroit, nearly 800 suspected radicals were rounded up, arrested, and kept in a dark, windowless hallway without access to a single bathroom for about a week. Half were released and admitted that they had been arrested as a mistake all along, without apology. In a somewhat more comical but equally serious example, a man was walking down Charlton Street in Newark, New Jersey, when he was arrested for quote-unquote looking like a radical. And the public was largely supportive of these raids, despite the fact that they violated the widespread civil rights of untold people. And one example, the Washington Post declared in response to the raid, "There's no time to waste here on hair splitting over the infringement of liberty." And that's where Post comes in. Post was an elderly civil servant. He was the Assistant Secretary of Labor. He was a 71-year-old who looked as if he was in his 80s. He was both dreary and antiquated and slight. He had this kind of old-looking goatee and a gray mop at the top of his head and old wire-rimmed glasses. He had been a lawyer, a journalist, now a civil servant. He was a hard man to understand and a hard man to simplify. But he also happened to become the acting Secretary of Labor, the number one official in the department during the time of the Palmer raids, and that gave him authority over who got deported. the way the authorities worked for the raids is that the Department of Justice would round up all the suspected radicals and then hand them over to the Department of Labor, which was then in charge of going through each case by case, and deciding who got to stay and who had to leave. The problem was that as soon as Post became the #1 official in the Labor Department, he began to systematically reverse all the Department of Justice's hard work. He would oversee over 1,600 deportation cases and cancel warrants in over 70% of them. And the public was furious. His name was smeared on a daily basis. In a sign of just how hated he was, the House began to hold public impeachment hearings, trying to do anything they could to get rid of him. And then in May of 1920, Post did something odd. He requested a chance to defend himself publicly before the committee. And the committee, apparently assuming that this old, frail man might say something, might give a slip-up, might say something that would help them in their case, might help lead to his impeachment, relented. They agreed. And it was here that Post made history. So Post appeared before the House of Representatives on the morning of May 7th, and his testimony would stretch into the following Saturday afternoon, before an antagonistic Congress full of staff members who had done their research just to try to embarrass him, full of committee members and congressmen who were there with the only goal of getting rid of him. Post displayed a quick wit, a nuanced mind. He knew the details of every case he'd overseen better than anyone else in the room. The papers would describe his performance as a clear victory. One would say, Post, 71 full of fight, flays Attorney General's work of persecuting men found innocent of wrong. Another would say, despite his 71 years, he seemed 25. But Post did two important things in his testimony, things that we can learn from today. And the first is that he attempted to put a face to the accusations. He attempted to put a face to the hysteria. He refused to talk about any of the accusations without actually delving into specific names, specific facts, specific people. Just to give you a sense of the dynamic, I want to read to you one of my favorite back and forths from the testimony, one that you could actually imagine taking place today. This was between Post and the chairman of the House Rules Committee, which was the committee that was looking into impeaching him. And it was about the worst of all threats. It was about the radical intellectual. So the chairman begins. He says, as a matter of fact, Mr. Post, don't you think these highbrow anarchists, these college professors, these Harvard and Yale anarchists, who weep in articles about the laboring man but never labored a day in their lives, don't you think they're more dangerous than the poor ignorant fellow who's willing to take up his hatchet and go up and break the government? Post responds, I have no opinion about that. You, of course, are using newspaper epithets, and I must be excused from giving an opinion upon mere epithets. Chairman responds, you understand what a highbrow anarchist is? He is the millionaire type of anarchist, the college professor type of anarchist. Post responds, suppose you give me names. I can answer better if you give me names. Chairman, I do not think that's necessary. Post, I do think that is necessary. I'm not going to decide against an unknown man merely because you call him a highbrow anarchist. And on the exchanges went. But then Post got even more specific. He brought up the actual names of the cases. He discussed the family members, the wives, and the children of the accused. In one case, for example, which Post had been very widely criticized about, he explained that there was doubt as to the radicalism of the person who was accused. That his family was composed of American citizens. He would say, I was not keen in the cases of persons who had good moral character and who had children born here who were American citizens, to break up their families, to send them away, to turn their wives and their children upon the community. I think that some humanity should come into the trial of these cases when there's doubt as to the guilt. The key here was that Post emphasized the humanity of the accused, that things were not always as black and white, as good versus evil, as they were portrayed by politicians and in the media. And then Post went on to do something else in his testimony. Beyond injecting faces and names, he spoke in terms of American values. He lectured in sweeping terms on the Constitution, on American history, on what it means to be an American. He illustrated how canceling these warrants, as he had done, was more American, in fact, than issuing them. And he understood that this movement, like all movements of political hysteria, is about defining what it means to be an American through exclusion, by saying we know who we are because we are not you. And he knew how to highlight this. He knew how to speak in language that the movement's supporters would understand. And I want to highlight his reasonableness here, and the risk he took in taking a public stand. He was really one man, alone in front of an angry nation. And he kept the bigger picture in mind, reminding his listeners and the accusers of what was at stake when these movements come up. And he also, quite importantly, he took this movement seriously. He didn't dismiss it as wild or crazy. He didn't dismiss its supporters as insane. He understood the power behind it. He understood the dangers that the accusations were capable of. Here's how Post ended his testimony. He said, "Now I shall quote one clause in Article 5, the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. If I am to be impeached for that, Mr. Chairman, I'm willing to be impeached." So Post didn't just attack Palmer, which he did, and he didn't just defend the details of the cases he'd overseen, which he also did. He cut to the heart of the movement. He talked about what it means to be an American. Within weeks of the testimony, Palmer was disgraced. Support for the movement eroded, so much so that when the largest terrorist attack occurred in American history up until that time, it's known as the Wall Street bombings, about 40 people were killed, over 140 seriously injured. The country barely blinked. The Cleveland Plain Dealer would describe the scene as follows. Would say capitalism is untouched. The federal government is not shaken in the slightest degree. The public is merely shocked, not terrorized. The hysteria had vanished. So, what I take from this book, from Post stories, from the movements that I researched, is that these movements arise and they claim to be protecting American identity from various threats. Masons, Islamists, communists, you name it. But in doing so, they undermine our core values. They undermine the very thing they claim to be protecting. They undermine the very idea that this is a country that people can come to be free, to live the lives they choose, and to hold the beliefs that they hold dear. So now I'd like to close by reading just a few lines from the concluding chapter of my book. We should approach supposed threats to our way of life with deep skepticism, just as we should remain wary of figures who seek to capitalize upon such risks. During the course of our 200-plus years of existence, this country has faced numerous perils, imagined and real. And yet, American society and our government remains. For as Thomas Jefferson once wisely declared, "If there be any among us who would wish to dissolve this union or to change its republican form, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated, where reason is left free to combat it. The best way to protect the freedoms we cherish is to leave them untouched, not just in periods of crisis, but in periods of normalcy as well." Thanks so much for coming out. And so I'm happy to take any questions, and there's a mic on either side of the main audience for people who want to ask questions.
I wonder if in some sense these movements are a desire to assert some sort of control over a situation which we really can't control because it's external, such as 9/11 and the whole anti-Muslim thing, which of course extended to a certain presidential candidate and elected president.
Yeah, exactly. I'd say actually one of the most fascinating things for me about researching for this book, and it's actually, this is, I cover some of what I'm about to say in chapter 1, which was trying to come up with a theory to understand how all of these movements work. And one of the things that was very fun was exploring how we've defined American identity, how the majority of us have defined what it means to be an American at any moment of time. So obviously, if you're going to say a movement arises in response to the way it's changing, you need to understand what it is. And so I think one of the most fascinating points, and something that you hint at, is that our sense of identity is always in flux. It's always changing. And so in that sense, there's always a vulnerability that I think you're kind of putting your finger on. And so at any moment when these movements arise, a lot of it arises in response to this vulnerability of this changing sense of who we are. It doesn't take a lot for us. I mean, our identity, our national identity, is not actually an unchanging thing. It's a series of arguments, and we affirm it in our daily lives. And so that in itself is something that's very hard to control. And so when that starts to change, I think we see exactly the type of kind of attempts to control it that you're describing.
Yeah, I mean, anti-Sharia law things seem totally ridiculous because it's not really a threat, but I suppose it can give some people a notion that it's dealing with a threat. Is it all really, though, part of the anti-immigrant waves that we constantly have?
So I would say there are two dangers there. The first is that the first danger is saying, oh, these people are just insane. This is just this is craziness. Sharia, what? They're doing this very funny series of logical arguments where they take real threats, they're real threats and violent Islamic extremists, and then they move them to just all of Islam, and then they connect that to the type of insecurity that we were just discussing. So that kind of chain of logic gets lost. I feel one of the reasons I wrote the book is because it gets lost when we just dismiss these movements and their supporters, some of whom are actually quite smart and quite accomplished, as crazy. So, yes. Sorry, the second part of that question, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, exactly. Can you remind me what the question was again? Xenophobia. One of the books that I actually relied on in writing this was a book called Strangers in the Land. It's by a guy named John Hyam. I don't remember when it was published, but it was decades ago, and it's a history of nativism in the United States. And it's related to it, but this is different. This is not about the simple, we don't like immigrants, kind of get off of our shores. There's a lot more going on when these arise. And if you look at it, again, McCarthyism, 5 years, it was basically officially 1950-ish to 1954. And to look at that through a lens of just xenophobia is to miss a lot of what's going on. So thank you for your questions. I think we have another.
I assume that there is actually no Sharia legal provisions on the books in Oklahoma or Louisiana, that the framework of state law doesn't include any such provisions. So, to what extent is there a genuine concern behind this phobia about Sharia law coming into force or being applied in those states, and how might it to any degree ever happen?
So the clear answer is, from an actual legal perspective, these fears are totally illegitimate. You can find there are some of these people, supporters of the movement, have gone through and tried to write reports, and most of them are very shoddy, where they say, here's a legal decision where a judge allowed a party to rely on Sharia law, and what they relied on was terrible, and we need to get rid of that. And so there are a few kind of very isolated instances. There's a prominent one in New Jersey where a man was beating his wife, and the judge ruled that he couldn't have had the mental state to know that it was wrong to beat his wife because he was a devout Muslim, and then very quickly that case was overturned. That's the one, if you actually look at the literature, as a separate note, you'll find like one or two just facts, very few facts that supporters of the movement can use, and then you'll see them everywhere, and that's actually one of the cases. But the truth is, there's no danger of Sharia law. I mean, there's no danger of any religious law overtaking any of the body of secular law that we respect in this country.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. When I first saw the title of this book, I immediately thought less of internal American hysteria, but rather being used for externally, and to promote certain positions of individuals, corporations. I guess I see it. I saw it more in terms of kind of how we've established our foreign policy since post World War II, and so while I understand now your kind of focus was on the targeting of certain groups within the United States, I just feel that it's a means of also creating, using the same tactics to amp up why we need to, say, be involved in Iraq for a longer period of time, or why we should invade Syria or something like that. And I don't know if that's this, I mean, it creates this hysteria like, oh my God, if we don't get in there, the world's going to fall apart. And I don't know if I just feel it's hysteria, some of it, without knowing all the facts, but it makes people fearful.
Yeah. So thanks. So I would say when I started writing the book, and in particular when I started using the term political hysteria, I was very conscious of the way that the word hysteria itself is thrown around quite generally. It's used most often as just a way of dismissing things that we don't like or that don't make sense. Actually has a very fascinating history in psychology of doing exactly that, where we don't know what's wrong with this person, so they're hysterical. And so this book is not, it's not about foreign policy at all. It's focused on national identity, but I would just caution from using, I hear you use the term hysteria, and it's used a lot in the media to say, you know, there's a hysteria going on about, for example, the justifications for the invasion of the Iraq War. And that's not the way that I actually use it and that I hope to use it. I know, you know, it's hard to keep control of these terms once
Right.
you put them out.
I just saw hysteria equal fear.
Yeah.
Playing on someone's fear.
Yeah. Thanks.
Hi, and congratulations on a great topic.
Thank you.
So my question runs to whether or not you had any insight into whether or not these waves of hysteria have any association with socioeconomic factors. And I'm coming from a place where there are a lot of concerns and there's a lot of conversation in the spaces that I travel in around our youth and their vulnerability to be tapped into around some of these forces. And some of that is associated with their own socioeconomic circumstances. So if you could speak to that.
So thanks. So without knowing it, actually, you just touched on the biggest and most prominent theory before I wrote this book about how these movements arise. Many of you have probably heard of him, a guy named Richard Hofstadter, who wrote this book called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. And that's actually what he said. He was looking at McCarthyism and trying to explain it, and he said, actually, that these periods only occur in times of economic booms. And he would say, his argument was that because they occur at times of economic booms, people have the luxury of stopping from looking at their economic concerns and then thinking about their status concerns. And that's something that I actually believe is deeply incorrect. It's one of, I think, the main things that differentiates what I say from what Hofstadter said many decades ago. But so I mean, there's a correlation in the sense that there's a correlation between what happens in the economy with what's happening with the way that we define national identity. So a good example of this is the slaveholders' role in national identity. That was very tied up in almost every issue, but to slaveholders, this was an economic issue. And they were, after the Civil War, they lost their piece of the pie in American identity. So there is a place for economics, but I don't think that's it. So, thanks.
Andrew, that's a terrific theme, terrific book, and I'm looking forward to reading it.
Thank you.
My question has to do, you seem to have focused in the examples you've given on movements of exclusion. Hysteria against the fear of bringing something that somehow stretches the diversity of the country in directions we don't like. And there are other hysterias you could call, depending on how long they last and how powerful they are, on inclusion. So it's the diversity versus the homogeneity of the tribe that seems to be at work here. And when my question is one regarding women's rights and the women's movement, which have taken many forms. There was a hysterical aspect to it. There was a more sort of longer term, more thoughtful aspect to it. And then it kind of fizzled out. So my question is, what makes these movements of inclusion or exclusion reach a peak, sometimes faster than others, and then eventually fizzle out?
So I have two answers for you. The first one is an answer that it's to a question I don't think you asked, but I'm just going to say it, because the way that I define political hysteria is these are movements of exclusion. The core way of defining it is these movements, so it's a noun, not an adjective. These movements arise, and what they are at their core is saying, we know who we are because we're not you. And so that's what they are. To the lifespan of these types of movements, I don't know how they would dovetail or overlap with other movements, either the women's rights movement or the anti-women's rights movements. But what I found that's fascinating is that these movements are kind of like a runner in full sprint. You can only keep up the pace for so long, and so the lifespan is a very essential feature. I think Harry Truman had a great line that said, "You can fool the American people, but only for so long," and that's the idea. You can convince people that foreign groups really do pose a threat. I mean, you can convince smart people that foreign groups really do pose a threat to their role in society, but you can't do it for long, and these movements always end up kind of collapsing in on these on themselves. So I don't know how that fits with the women's rights movement, but that may be a parallel. So
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Yes.
Hi. I have a question that goes not so much to the substance, but to the writing process, because I'm very interested in that. First of all, I want to congratulate you on a job really well done.
Thank you.
One of the things I appreciate in this book is the clarity with which you articulate your argument and your thesis, and that you define hysteria, because it gives us language. It gives us an ability to talk, understanding each other. And then you did what you lauded Post for doing. I think you gave us readers the ability to understand your argument posited in the beginning by giving us examples, by giving us a face, a human face, and concrete examples. And I was curious as to how you selected these out of presumably many others.
Yeah. So the characters or the movements or both?
Well, it seems to me that the characters, by using characters, you put a face on a movement.
Okay. All right. So I'll answer the characters then.
All right,
Question.
answer the characters. Yeah.
So that was actually I would say one of the things that was the most fun and also the hardest about putting this book together, which is I figured out what the major movements were I wanted to focus on, the movements that would give readers a sense of, the patterns and how this had played out literally to the time of our founding. But then my focus was on telling a story. I went to law school, so I really knew what it meant to be bored by reading. Really, I can't stress that enough. And so what I wanted to do is respect the reader's time. I wanted to respect I wanted to draw people in and have it be fun to read. And so that was where most of my focus went after I'd set up the theory. And so what I would do is I would look at the lifespan of the movement and try to figure out, I would start with dates. So, if you do a story arc for a movie or something like that, I would try to find where's the narrative, where were the major points in the lifespan of the movement. And then I would look at who was involved. And obviously, you can't capture a whole movement, but I would pick the characters that I thought kind of mixed the actual content of the story, and then the very fun and exciting things that happened, like the spy stories, the crimes. I wanted to, I again conscious of trying not to bore the reader.
Just brought it all to life.
Yeah.
So I think that's a real strength of this book,
Yeah.
that the reader is just drawn in.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I'm so happy to hear that.
Well, hi. I haven't read the book, so I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage. But there's just two things I wanted to ask. One is I don't know anything about the anti-Masonic movement. I'm just wondering, how could they do that when we had our founding fathers were mostly Masons? How did they decide that was un-American? And then my other question was, I think you mentioned something in your introduction that you had a favorite moment in your research, and I was hoping you'd share that.
Oh yeah. So I'm actually okay. So let me go last to first. So favorite moment was when Post stood in front of this angry nation in the House of Representatives. But I actually now you've given me an excuse to share with you another one of my favorite moments, which I was thinking, how would I have an opportunity to read this? And so now you've given me one. So I'm actually so thank you. So yeah, please, yeah, you can every talk I give, you can just so one of the ways, it's funny, I say these movements aren't actually about what they claim to be. They use all this rhetoric, but at their deepest level, they're about something else. And so the best example I came across in all of the research of this is that during just after the Palmer raids, Attorney General Mitchell Palmer ran for president, and he ran on this platform of what he called Americanism. And so I'm going to read to you just a quote from one of his, it might have been when he announced his campaign, but this was like the heart of his presidential campaign. And I think there's no better sign that what he stood for was this like vacuous patriotism, but I'm going to read it and you'll see it. You can judge for yourself. So here's his platform. I am myself an American, and I love to preach my doctrine before undiluted 100% Americans because my platform is, in a word, undiluted Americanism. So, thank you. Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, so the first question. So how did the anti-Masonic movement take place? So it's true, I don't remember the exact numbers. I think it was like 13 of the, I don't know, however many original signers of the Declaration of Independence were actually Masons. So that's actually part of the reason why it arose. It arose in the 1820s at a time of deep growing economic inequality, and it was the beginnings, the real like birth pangs of industrialism, the rise of manufacturing, and there was this common sense that there was a question: how can America survive if there is this class of merchants who care more about themselves than they care about others? So it was actually a real problem that we confronted, and the Masons symbolized that class. Here was a secretive order that looked after themselves. They were mostly middle class people with time and leisure, and so that the Masons symbolized, again, there's a real threat. The symbolic threat was just this new kind of anti-democratic sentiments that were being brought up by the new changes in the economy. So hopefully that gives you a good answer.
Hi. You chose to write about 5 of these movements, and so in my Hysteria, I'm thinking there's probably 100 more. But what are some of the ones you didn't bother to write about?
So there are 2. So my goal in choosing the 5 was to kind of, again, without taking too much of readers' time and focusing on the stories, give a broad sense of how this phenomenon stretches across American history. But you are quite right, there were a bunch of movements I would have loved to focus on. One was the Know Nothing Party. It was anti-Catholic. It took place right after the anti-Mason movement, and so it kind of got the short shrift in the book. But interestingly, it arose from a secret movement. It arose from secret societies that were meeting to counteract the influence of Catholicism in the United States. And because these societies were secret, these anti-Catholic societies, if you asked people where they had been, their instructions were to say, I know nothing. And so that's why they became the Know Nothing Party, and they actually became a major force in American politics, a huge party. So that's one. At the end of the 19th century, there was a lot of anger against the rise of trusts and monopolies, and tied into that was had strands of anti-Semitism, but it was an anti-capitalist kind of feeling, and part of it was that there were these bankers, many of them Jewish, part of a cabal that were controlling the world in secret. And that's actually one that I would have loved to look at. The Populist Party, which did a lot of good things, also did some bad things. I think it's called the Omaha Platform, is their 1894 platform. Actually said that. It said there's a secret conspiracy of bankers pulling the purse strings of governments around the world and exerting this terrible influence on our society. So I would have loved to explore that as well. Those are 2 examples. Maybe my next book, we'll see. Yeah. Yes?
When the movement first emerges, are there any telltale signs that indicate whether it's going to be a political hysteria, or, on the other hand, a legitimate movement that deserves to endure, such as perhaps the long-delayed assertion of civil rights on behalf of previously neglected groups?
Yeah, so it's a very hard question because these movements are very clear in retrospect. And as a sign of that, when I first started researching the anti-Sharia movement, it took me many more months than I would wish to be able to understand where all the errors were. There are a lot of things to be scared about when you talk about violent Islamic extremism. Some of those have a connection to fundamentalist Islam, and so it's very confusing. Sadly, I wish it was more evident. The intuition that I have is that we know these movements are dangerous when they connect to deep changes in American identity. I mean, as a sign, the anti-Sharia movement didn't really begin until 2007, 2008, during the recession. The terrorist attacks of 9/11 occurred over half a decade before then. So you can kind of look to signs that what they're about is not really what they're about. And if that takes place, during periods of profound change like 2008 was, I think you can kind of have a sense that we're in trouble. But On the other hand, I was just recently reading that there's a book called Days of Rage, which I'm sure is on one of these bookshelves, which is great, which is about the underground anti kind of revolutionary movements of the late 60s and early 70s. And there was a period between 1971, 18 months starting 1971, when there are 2,500 bombings across the United States. Most of it, exactly, we think, oh my God, I can't believe this. And they kind of just went unnoticed. And so it's an open question why. I mean, that's way more of a threat than took place from anarchists right after World War I. So the question is, why didn't a period of political hysteria happen then? And I think the answer has to do with we weren't as insecure about what it meant to be an American. There weren't as deep changes. But so sadly, there's no science, there's no math to this. So
Thank you.
yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Please.
Yes, I think I accept your concern about the hysteria generated for a lot of reasons, political and other reasons. But I'm also concerned about those who are caught up in this hysteria, not the leadership, but the followership. And with the media we have now, with social media, it's very easy to reach out and gather people who will follow these things. And I'm particularly concerned about communities that are in need and have a lot of disaffected and low income who are very receptive to be angry with this government that we love. And I don't know whether you went into this or thought about this, and I think it's not quite within your book yet or in this book, but that's my concern, is how you deal with communities who are vulnerable and who would feel identity with anything that might be different from what they have now, and therefore would be caught up, and particularly with social media gathering and collecting them so easily.
So the good news on that, the good news actually to me, is that for the anti-Sharia movement at least, the numbers support skews older. So the younger Americans are, the more accepting they are. So a lot of the appeal of the exclusive appeal of these movements actually vanishes the younger you go. So the closer you get to, like, the high school aged youth, there's not a lot to build off of there. The anti-Sharia movement is not.
I'm from east of the river. We got a lot of adults who are 21, 19, 30 who are very unemployed, angry, unhappy. And and Homeland Security is about to move into our neighborhood.
Yeah. So the question is, what do you do? I mean, I don't think that population is at the same type of risk. Most of the people who tend to support the anti-Sharia movement are elderly people. They lost the recession. They lost their pensions in the recession. It's a different type. These are actually people who are deeply threatened by diversity. The broader question about what to do with disaffected, angry youth living in a culture that does not make use of them as it should is much broader than my book. I wish I had an answer. I'll get back to you on that. So, yes, please.
Well, Andrew did a good job. Thank you. I have a comment and I have a question. You said sort of very clearly that there's really no threat of religious ideology affecting our our legal system. What about women's rights, abortion, anti-abortion? What about marriage equality? These seem to be very real issues, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. A larger question in my mind is when you talk about hysteria, political hysteria, certainly that can arise grassroots, gets picked up by politicians, or it can be promulgated by politicians and then picked up by grassroots. And I'm wondering if you've given any thought or have any ideas about that. I mean, there are a lot of people that have a lot of ideas about conspiracy theories and all that stuff. So it becomes important in that sense. Clearly McCarthy used this idea for his own political advantage, but I guess that's it.
Yeah. So I'm going to take the question I want to answer the least first, which is the very difficult one about the role the valid role of religion in a democracy. So that question is much broader than Islam. It touches on, the abortion fight, evangelicals. I don't know what to say other than that in the way we think about democracy here, it's good if people can fight for their beliefs. So we like the idea of people having heartfelt beliefs, even if we disagree with them, and we advocate their way, their rights to elect people to represent them. The worry that this book addresses, and that I assert quite confidently is non-existent, is that anyone is going to actually replace secular laws with religious laws. So that's a clear non-starter. But when you have politicians representing people who hold convictions that are tied to religions, that's different, and it's complicated, and I don't really know how to answer that question because we've been struggling with it for 200 plus years. But it's a very good question. So the second question is how these movements arise, bottom up or top down, and it's a combination of both. One of the things, if you look at each of these movements and try to figure out how they actually deviate from each other, that's actually one of the things I would say where they do deviate. There's examples of everything. I can talk about each one, but I'd say like one of the fascinating ones is the Anti-Illuminati movement, the 1790s, which was really kind of centered around one man. It was very much top down. It might have been because the media structures of the day, we didn't have social media, but I don't know. There's no one single way that these movements take shape. What's common is the content of what they're about, but not how they evolve. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. All right.
So in confronting these movements or manias, facts are often not your most effective weapon, right? Because the other side often holds their beliefs with sort of ideological or religious fervor. And you talk about this a little bit in your book about what more effective ways of dealing with these movements should be. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, so the conclusions that I come to is in the end of the book about what we can actually do. And the conclusions are based off of the research of this professor of law and psychology at Yale named Dan Kahan. And basically, he studies climate change and why, if you actually look at the data, it shows that in some cases, the more educated a person is, the less likely they are to believe in the existence of climate change. So he explores what you do and how you actually address where in arguments where facts actually seem to make people angry. So basically his conclusions are you use two weapons, and the first is trust and the second is values. And that's what we can come up against these movements with. And the first is when we're addressing them, we need to demonstrate that its supporters can trust us, that we need to figure out some way, if we're trying to convince them otherwise, to show them that we're part of their tribe, we're part of their community. And if we can't do that, if, for example, we're a female Muslim woman wearing a headscarf, she's not going to have a lot of sway addressing members of the anti-Sharia movement. So what she could do, someone like that, is to try to get members of the community that other people trust to endorse them, to try to build off of the trust of other people. And then the second thing is when it comes to actual values, is that just as these movements are not actually about the threats that they claim to be, they're about the actual values that the supporters feel are threatened, is that we need to speak in that language, just like Post did. So you don't actually fight fact with fact. You fight what these movements claim to be facts with assertions about values, with assertions about what it actually means to be an American. You do exactly actually what Post did at the end of the book. There's really no better example of how to engage with these movements and how to take them on than Post.
I think that's really a valuable lesson for a lot of situations we find today, including the U.S. Congress. Seems to be fact adverse in some of these debates. Anyway, if there are no more questions, let's give Andrew a round of applause. Top